Welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. It's exciting to have so many law firms joining us today. First of all, just a little bit of housekeeping. We'll be finishing perhaps 10 minutes late, but so apologies for that. But if you're not able to stay for the final bit, you will be getting a recording next working day, which will be in both video and podcast form for you to listen to at your leisure and also share with your colleagues. We'll also be sending you a questionnaire a little later on. Just if you could spare 1 minute to give us feedback, that would be enormously helpful, and thank you in advance for doing that. Just to introduce myself before I introduce my colleague Katie, my name is Tim Priceman. I'm with Kelso Consulting. We're a firm of award-winning reputation builders. We're a public relations agency. I've been working with law firms and also legal sector suppliers to get them particularly into the national media, whether it's national newspapers, broadcasters, business media. I'm particularly work with a range of businesses, including law firms, on thought leadership areas, and indeed I have written the book on it, which is an ideal Christmas present for friends and loved ones. What we're going to be covering today is a number of very important things to help you up the impact and effectiveness of the PR work you undertake. We'll be looking at what do journalists look for in interviewees. After all, if you can provide that, then you're more likely to be interviewed. If you're more likely to be interviewed, you're going to get more press coverage. We'll particularly be looking at getting into the legal press, as Katie was on the legal press for 8 years, and so we'll have some very valuable first-hand insights. We'll be looking at 5 approaches that work with, particularly with the national newspapers and business media. Given the momentous events earlier in the week, we'll be looking at using court cases for coverage, and indeed we will be answering all your questions. Can I particularly ask regarding questions? We will be taking them at the end, but please do fire them through, and we will be answering those towards the end, but also fire them through anyway, as we will be taking them as we go through. Also, can I say, if you are listening to this on a recording, send us through your questions anyway, and we will respond to you. Okay, so Katie, can I ask you to introduce yourself and say a few words?
Yes, so hi everyone, thanks again for joining us. A little bit about me. So about 18 months ago, I joined Kelso Consulting, where I now work as a PR. And before that, I was a legal freelance writer. And before that, I spent 8 years at The Lawyer. So I have quite a lot of experience in the legal profession. And it's fair to say that while I was at The Lawyer, I spent a lot of time writing maybe thousands of stories as a litigation reporter, covering court cases, as well as the business of law. So this was I started back in 2008 when we were riding on the back of the litigation boom following the economic crash. And I also, perhaps interestingly, covered the opening of the Supreme Court and judicial appointments and QC promotions and partner promotions, etc. Before later being promoted to news editor, where I became responsible for a team of reporters and all the news that appeared on the website daily, filtering the wheat from the chaff. So I suppose my insight today comes from being on the receiving end of thousands of press releases, pitches and interview pitches, and generally just reporting the news. So I'll be talking about what journalists want to hear from their legal sources, and how to go about building your firm's media presence so that journalists come to you rather than your rivals. Okay.
Fabulous. Okay, so could I just say a few words about Kelso Consulting? There's people on the line who know us, but also people who join us who are less familiar with us. As mentioned, we've got an award-winning public relations consultancy. We've been around, indeed, dealing and representing law firms for well over 20 years. We do all the sorts of services you would expect from a public relations agency, and maybe some you wouldn't. We help our clients win awards, and indeed Katie was on the judging panel for the Lawyers Awards if you are looking for someone who can particularly help in that area. We are very successful with helping law firms with their legal directory entries to get the best possible results from them. What I'd say is we style ourselves as reputation builders. Now, lawyers, I think, intrinsically know that reputation is important, but they also tend to think that reputation sort of tends to come purely from providing good legal advice and maybe getting a few good cases. Well, certainly those things are very important, but if you want to stand out in the crowded legal market, it's going to take more than that. And we are very much about giving the strongest possible helping hand to help law firms build reputations and stand out. Now, in theory, dealing with the media is simple. You do a little bit of thought about who are your key audience and what are the media sources and indeed other sources that are credible with them. You have something newsworthy to say, and we'll certainly be looking at that in this webinar. You go about dealing with the media in the right way, and we'll be talking about that. And don't give up after the first attempt. Now, what I would say, the areas we're going to concentrate on, having something newsworthy to say, dealing with the media in the right way, my observation is that law firms, not just law firms, but many firms fall down through really overcomplicating these two stages, or indeed through perhaps not going about them the right way. And this is very much where we get involved, and we'll be talking a bit more about them. First of all, I'd just like to say a few words about the modern media landscape. If you pick up any How to Do It PR guide from which is more than a few years old, while the core elements have not changed in 5 years. Indeed, the core elements have not changed in 20 years. But what has changed is the pace and the pressures that journalists are under from the online world, not just the online world, and in a way the compression of deadlines this has caused, but also by most media have found their business model has been destroyed. That has led to fewer journalists, higher competition for coverage, and indeed fewer journalists writing more pieces than ever. What this means is your press releases, your announcements are under really have to fight for not really space, because you could argue that space is infinite in the online world, but for the very, very limited time availability of the few remaining journalists. Now, Katie, perhaps we could talk a bit about what journalists want, and particularly what they want from spokespeople. After all, if you want to be interviewed, you need to give journalists what they are looking for, or they won't want to interview you. When you were a journalist, what were you looking for?
Well, I suppose to put it bluntly, they and I wanted people who are available to comment, who are available to comment at speed, were not afraid to make a point, and can speak in a language that everyone understands. I think those are my 3 key points up front. And what we found was, and I'm going to talk a bit more generally around this, is that while there were a handful of lawyers and that are happy to speak to the press, the majority of them are not. It's not in their comfort zone, and they just are worried that they might say something and it becomes misquoted further down the line, and they become nervous. So what firms need to do is look for people who are more confident in talking to spokespeople who are confident in talking to the press, and that know their subject properly, and they're comfortable with talking about it, and they understand that there is no such thing as off the record, but they know that they want to be quoted and where they want to be quoted. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think it's worth saying that if you do have these sorts of nervy people, well, training can take some of the edge off it. Maybe they would be better deployed rather than dealing with the legal press or ones that give them the anxiety. They might be better deployed writing articles or with less, shall we say, less threatening media rather than thrown in the maelstrom of dealing with the lawyer.
Well, yeah, exactly. Because what we would find, and I don't think it's just the lawyer, is that some journalists are not all, but some journalists are very well versed in the law. So they are very familiar with the topics and can quiz you about everything. And so if you have a spokesperson who is unfamiliar or gives the wrong answer because they're nervous about getting it wrong, and it leads to all sorts of problems further down the line. So your spokesperson has to be knowledgeable about that topic. And not only that, they have to be able to communicate in straightforward terms that everyone can understand. While legal publications generally do just speak to lawyers and in-house lawyers, it still has to be a language that non-lawyers understand, because that contingent is growing, and it has to be readable and newsworthy. So, for instance, if you're talking about changes in your firm, such as a team hire or a key partner hire, it might be easy to explain to a business audience the implications of that hire and what they mean to your business. But if you're commenting on a legal case, which we'll talk about a bit more later, and the legal procedure behind that, you need to offer a deep level of expertise, but in a way that everybody can understand. I was going to say, I should add on some more. I've got some more to say about this, because I think it's also important to talk about context, in particular with your firm. If you're talking about a particular piece of news within your firm, for instance, to go back to partner hires, the context of their hire, what it means for your firm, what it means for the local market, perhaps, if you're a regional firm. And you have to remember that journalists may have arrived at work today. They may never have even heard of your firm. They might not know that you are the best media firm in the country. And so you need to be able to explain that without being condescending and patronising, but also by offering up your knowledge on a plate, really, for them to be able to follow it. And you may want to, my personal preference as a reporter, and this is what I was encouraged to do by my editor at the time, is get as much information from the lawyer as possible when they were being interviewed, because that might contribute to one story now, but there might be a snippet of information within that news story that could make the basis for a further story or a wider feature or quote. So you might not get picked up in that initial news story, but you might be laying the foundations for something else that they're thinking about further down the line.
I think
make sure.
Oh, sorry. No, carry on, Katie.
I was going to say, when you're thinking about that, I think it's quite key to understand the audience that you're talking to, and that comes back as well to language as well. So you're talking to the lawyer, you're talking to a legal audience, but if you're talking to the Guardian, it's a layman's audience that aren't legally familiar. So taking the time to prepare for interviews, understanding your audience and getting your language right and putting it into context are all really key factors when it comes to talking to the media.
An area also I think it's worth highlighting, particularly in the past very few years, is diversity delivers coverage. If you think about media, most journalists are in fact female. They want the photos that appear in their magazine, their interviewees, to reflect the diversity of the industry, and indeed you've got to bear in mind as well that the typical journalist is a metropolitan millennial. That is the audience you need to play to. And the reality is, if your list of spokespeople are all white male and middle class, you're going to get less coverage than a firm that puts up a more diverse range of spokespeople. Simple as that. Whether you like it or not, that's the way it works in the legal press, that's the way it works in the nationals, that's the way it works elsewhere as well nowadays.
I could talk to you about that from a journalistic perspective. There was a firm, it's true, most of all the legal press want to be seen to be embracing diversity. I think that's a historical thing. And so they will pick up on news stories that they think doesn't embrace those values. For instance, a large top 20 firm that promoted year after year just men to the partnership, and they had never even considered that would lead to negative coverage further down the line. But when the lawyer did a 5-year analysis of their gender diversity, it showed that it was 95% male at the promotions, and that leads to a negative story in the press. They took changes. A year later, there were quotas, but it wasn't until the spotlight was put on that issue that it becomes an issue. So you need to think about diversity. I agree with Tim.
Okay, now Katie, moving on to getting into the legal press, we have a lot of attendees who are perhaps from smaller and perhaps smaller end of mid-size. Some are in London, some are in nicer parts of the country. Ultimately, they're not churning out announcements the way the big firm does. They'll have occasional ad hoc announcements that they want to get into legal press. They probably don't, or maybe not, have existing relationships. What would be your advice for firms such as this on how they go about getting their announcements into the legal press?
So I think there is no hard and fast, sure way to get you into the legal press, but there are two windows of opportunities that are open to every single firm to grab their interest. The first is when you're doing your partner promotions in the year, and the second is your results. Now, not all partner promotions will be picked up and reported, but as I said before, this is an opportunity to share with the legal press what is happening strategically within your firm. So you may have a firm of 10 partners, but this year you're promoting 2 corporate partners. That's a big chunk. Why is that happening? And you might say, oh, well, we've got new clients on the back of this. That's why we're doing this. And we're working with them in this fantastic new way. And on all this, you can build into your press release. It's how much investment and time you want to put into it, but really building those relationships and talking more widely about the strategic reasoning behind that press release is going to be much more interesting than saying Bob and Joe have just been promoted to the partnership this week. So you need to talk about it within your firm, how you want to portray that. And it's the same with your results, whether they are good or bad. Now, from a purely the lawyer perspective, because that's what I'm most familiar with, if you're in the UK 200, the lawyer will send a reporter to speak to you. And this is a good opportunity to choose the right person, someone who is personable, who can talk more broadly about the firm and what it's doing and start to build relationships with that interviewee, with that journalist. And there might be other legal publications that are similarly interested in your results, or your sectors, which Tim will talk about later, who are interested in your results. It's about looking at it in context and putting your business news into context so that you are seen to be a leader in your field or creating new trends in your field so that it becomes more newsworthy than just up 5% this year, or we've promoted 2 partners this year. I was thinking about how you get in touch, and I suppose in the good old days it used to be a phone call, but that meant we were always on the phone and never much working. I think the modern way today is to send a press release and follow it up with a call or 2, or until you get in touch with the reporter. Now, offering an exclusive, legal journalists are still get excited about exclusives, especially if it's something that's going to change the way of the market. And most of our regional firms aren't going to have that kind of news on hand. But still, if you think that it's worth that offering an exclusive, i.e. you give it to one legal publication and none of the others, then rather than sending the press release and saying, hey, would you like this? The best thing to do would be to call up the reporter and tempt them with a snippet of your news and gauge their interest to see whether they want the exclusive. And don't just give up if they say, no, not interested. Don't just give up after sending it, especially if you haven't heard personally from them. If your release has merit and it is newsworthy, you need to persuade the journalist and their editor of that merit. So the reporter will have a news list. They need to go to their news editor and say, this is what I'm writing about this week. And the news editor will say, that's interesting, or that's not interesting. And the reporter will have to say, well, actually, it is interesting, and this is why. And you need to help them with those reasons.
I think the important part of that, Katie, is firms need to realise that they need to, if they want to be in the legal press, and particularly if they're not a magic circle type size firm, they in a way need to dance to the tune of the publication rather than expect the publication to dance to their time. In an example I had recently, the publication was determined that the firm was determined the announcement would go out on a Monday, but the story was leaked and by the other firm, and the press were already carrying it. I phoned up the publication, funnily enough, and also it was on a Friday, and they said there's 2 of us cover it. It was 2:30 on a Friday. They said there's 2, because of illnesses, there's 2 of us covering 6 stories before we go home tonight. But if you get the press release through, we'll try and carry it. So it's no good the firm saying, well, we want it on Monday. You've got to respond to the way the publication works.
Yeah, I think there's I agree with you there. It's journalists are under a lot more pressure. They're, as we've already said, they're really small teams. So if you want to get the coverage, you need to play by their tune. I mean, larger firms have the budgets to pay for highly skilled PRs, but smaller firms don't have that luxury. So the best way is
they
for
can
lawyers
still get
to
highly skilled PRs like us, Katie.
Oh yeah, sorry.
In-house.
In-house. If you're in the city, there are lots of legal PRs, but the roles are different in smaller firms as well. So really, you need to be making sure that you've got the right person there putting out, whether it's PR or the managing partner, and they're out and about and being seen to be out and about. Sorry, excuse me.
So in terms of London, so as I mentioned, there are indeed firms from London here who are in the position to go visit the legal press, as virtually all of them are based in the centre. But there's also firms from around the country who can't just pop out for a quick coffee or a beer after work. But also perhaps are journalists less inclined? They certainly are on most other trade publications. Perhaps you could talk about what's the best way to build up these sorts of relationships with legal journalists.
My personal preference was always to meet somebody face to face, but I had a bit more time, I suppose, and freedom. I think I used to travel around the country to firms and see what they were doing in-house, and I was very lucky to be able to do that. Modern media just doesn't do it. So if you want to meet them for coffee, if you want to meet a journalist for coffee and you don't expect them to come out of London, you will have to go to them. Now, appreciate that that's a lot of time and investment for you to go there. And so what I would suggest is that the best way to do it is to attend industry events, awards, conferences, networking events, and then use that as a way of finding journalists and start talking about what's happening in your local market and draw their attention to your local market. Now, you never know, it might lead to a regional report on what's happening in Manchester or in Sheffield or Leeds, all big legal markets. What are the trends? Are you seeing, for instance, lots of lawyers coming out of London and joining your city? Are you working with fintechs in a new and exciting way, or some blue chip clients? If meeting with journalists, it doesn't necessarily mean having to sit down for a 3-course meal at lunchtime or going out for pints after work. I think use your time to your best effect by going to networking events, coming with a message that you are ready to deliver, finding those journalists and talking to them, and starting to build that foundations of those relationships so that they come to you when the time is right.
Okay, excellent. So if people have more questions on that, fire them through and we'll be picking them up later on. Time is always our enemy on webinars, so we just need to move on to cover some of the areas, and we'll be picking up your questions later on. So one area, and I think this very much builds on many of the things you were saying there, Katie, but we're going to be talking now about getting into the other national media, not the legal press, but things like national newspapers, business publications. These could be particular trade sector ones, or it could be professional magazines like, say, Economia for accountants and HR for HR publications. And these are really good. In many ways, I would see these as better places for many law firms to be in, as they are speaking directly to clients and prospects. Clearly, the legal press is excellent for both recruitment, but also talking to in-house lawyers, or indeed referrers and things like this. But for many lawyers, the business and national press is particularly useful. So I want to talk about 5 ways that would really work. Now, not surprisingly, a lot of lawyers and indeed other professionals want to be seen as the expert. If you are seen as the expert, journalists come to you. But it's a bit of a circular position. How do you start breaking in to this magic group of people who are seen as go-to experts? Now, first of all, if you are a technical expert who hides in your office, it's always going to be a struggle. If you want to be approached as an expert, you need to act like one, you need to look like one, you need to walk the part, rather than expecting press coverage will make you look like an expert. What you need to think is that press coverage will echo your status as an expert. The more you look like an expert, the more likely you are to get coverage, the more likely you are to get repeat coverage. And Katie, I don't know if you find this, but often I find firms wanting to build up people, and so you look at their profile on the website, which often partner profiles other than the homepage are the most visited pages on law firm websites, and it's cobwebby. There's nothing on there. It's bland and cobwebby. Probably hasn't been updated since the day he, or occasionally she, joined. And whatever it does has been very, very generic and doesn't, other than position them as a lawyer with lots of qualifications, doesn't really say very much about them. You often find this on LinkedIn profiles as well.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. The website is the window on the firm, and it's often the most overlooked part of it. I'd agree.
And we'll move on to Twitter very briefly. I'm not saying everyone here should start tweeting if they're not doing so already, but I would flag up that Twitter is actually very popular amongst journalists. As I mentioned earlier, most of the millennials, they grew up with Twitter. They like its immediacy. You'll often see in press coverage that tweets are quoted. They see it as a source of news story, and indeed they look for experts on Twitter. So again, these are things to bear in mind. A lot of lawyers are very savvy with LinkedIn and Twitter. A lot of them aren't. If you aren't, you're at a disadvantage. So, moving on a bit, you want to be the expert? There's a few areas that you need to avoid. Certainly don't set out. There is no point being the expert on obscure areas that no one will ever care about, and then trying to persuade the media that they should pay lots of interest to it. That is not going to work. If you are the expert on a really obscure technical area, you want to be in the media, really you're going to have to broaden your appeal. Number two, don't do the opposite and go for really broad areas. Yes, it would be lovely to be seen as the expert on everything to do with tax and everything to do with property. But the reality is there's too much competition and it's too bland. You need to be the expert for particular areas. Even if it is a subset of your broad area of expertise, even if it is a subset of your firm's broad area of expertise. So what are the sorts of things that are going to work well? Well, you certainly want to seek to be the expert for important issues that are going to be in the media. Maybe they're not going to be in the media next week, but they are going to be in it periodically. If they're going to be in the media periodically, that gives you the chance to piggyback them, which is much easier to seek a quote in something the journalist already wants to write about than spend a lot of time persuading journalists that something they've got no interest in is actually something they should write about. I'm not saying you should never do that, but I'm just saying it's a harder approach. If you can be an expert on something that has predictable dates, then so much the better, because you can put them in your diary and plan for them. Predictable dates could be around cases, they could be around regulation and its introduction, or it could be around the business calendar. So, for instance, if you are an expert on things to do with cyber trading and online business, then Black Friday should be in your diary, as should be the run-up to it. Katie mentioned about the whole area of distinctive insights, viewpoints, and having some the more data and the more proof points you have behind it, the better. Ultimately, experts don't just assert lots of things, they prove them, they illustrate them, they make them interesting. And if you're starting off, then clearly you want to go, if humanly possible, for areas where you have a good base of credibility. It is much easier to build on large foundations than it is to have no foundations. So again, yes, this wonderful new practice area of one person with no clients might be the sort of area, he's got lots of time and you want to build up the practice. That might well be a good place to start, but don't forget that's actually starting from a very low base, whereas your corporate team churning in lots of work and with lots of expertise may be easier to promote as well. So, building on that, it's key to start thinking about segments and sectors. It's very easy as a law firm to fall into the trap of thinking, we only deal with, we're a law firm, so ergo we deal with the legal press and the legal correspondence on the nationals. Whereas if you start looking at sectors, segments, professions, whatever, that are particularly important for your practice and start targeting those, you will find it a lot easier to build up coverage in trade publications than you will trying to be one. Well, take the Financial Times. If they cover a legal story, they're probably going to quote 2 firms in it. And there are probably 50 firms competing for it, including Magic Circle and all of these ones. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, and indeed we've had success getting our clients in that sort of thing, but it's starting at the hard place. Whereas if you start, for instance, Katie mentioned fintech, say your firm wants lots of fintech clients, the starting point is to start getting in things like banking technology, fintech journal, specialist banking, those sorts of publications. If you're after the retail sector, it's retail ones, that sort of thing. First of all, it's easier to get in. Secondly, it's not only easier to get in, it's easier to get in repeatedly and start building up your reputation through repeat coverage rather than a one-off bit. But also what it means is you are then positioned as the expert in that area. So when a legal issue to do with fintech bubbles up to the nationals, first of all, you are in a much better position. Maybe the journalist has been, well, first of all, if it's been covered by the legal journalist, you can go to them and say, look, our person's the expert on this, look at all this coverage in the trade press, which gives a powerful so what, why should they quote him or her, rather than someone from Eversheds or Clifford Chance. Number 2, the reality with a lot of these areas, in fact most of these areas, is it won't be covered by the legal correspondent. If it's something to do with fintech, it will probably be covered by one of their tech or financial or even personal finance journalists. It won't be covered probably by the legal press. If it's a retail area, it's probably going to be covered by the retail correspondent. These people tend to follow these trade publications. Even if they don't, quite frankly, they are less fussed about targeting or getting quotes from Magic Circle or Eversheds or whatever. They don't really know. A lawyer is a lawyer to them, and you are positioned as the credible expert through that track record. Okay, so I think I've made the point about why you need to be looking at trade publications. The third approach that works really well is so simple and straightforward. Most PR publications, most of how to do it PR guides don't even mention it. Most PR agencies and press offices forget about it, and yet it works really well. So, letters to the editor. So I am talking, most publications, particularly nationals, but not only, have a letters section. The Times letters section is famous. They are online as well. But I'm not talking about the silly ranting comments that people post underneath articles. I'm talking about the specific and curated letters to the editor section. Now, what we find, and I won't go through this in detail, but there is a magic formula, some parts of which I have highlighted here, but I will send it to you in an email afterwards, which I find, once you've done it a couple of times, get your swing in, gives you about a 70% chance rate of getting your letter published. And what's the value of having your letter published? Well, actually the letters section is one of the most read bits of the publication. Whenever I've done it for myself, people have always contacted me about saying they read my letter, and we've indeed had clients we've done this for who've picked up instruction simply through having a letter published in the FT. How do you go about it? Well, first of all, you need to study and read the publication, otherwise you're never going to do it. Secondly, you need to respond quickly in the right way, and we will set that out in the email. And the third thing is, don't give up after the first attempt. You need clearly 2 or 3 attempts to start to get your swing in, but what you should do is when your letter isn't published and someone else's is published, look at their letter and think, why was that published, not mine, and what can I learn about it for the next time? Okay. So, the fourth area that works very well is piggybacking both legal cases but also broader business news. Katie, we've had some pretty momentous events this week.
Yeah, there I am at the Supreme Court a few years ago. Yeah, we have. It's been a very busy week for the Supreme Court, and I think it's got the whole of Twitter in meltdown and the legal community all looking at the Supreme Court. So I thought it might be good here to talk about the Supreme Court and look at the lessons we can learn there and then apply them to the lower courts. So, and also I ought to just mention that while most of you will know that you aren't able to comment on cases that have been heard but are awaiting judgment, there will be journalists that call up and ask for your opinion on the outcome of a case. Refuse to comment, explain the law, and it might be that you're speaking to somebody that's never written about a court case before, but never comment on live cases that are awaiting judgments. But what you can do, however, is talk about court procedure and context, like I've mentioned before, perhaps the legal teams involved, or maybe the case because it's being structured in an interesting way, a group litigation order, for instance, that takes on claimants in an interesting way. Or to put that into the context of the Supreme Court earlier this week, we had 11 judges sitting on the bench, and the ruling they gave was unanimous. Now, I think that is pretty rare from my history. I think it's pretty rare, and we've got Lady Hale, who has been catapulted to stardom and has somehow become a fashion icon. So if you were looking at the Supreme Court this week, and I know this is a high-profile case, but you can take it to any case that has relevance for your firm. You could have blogged about the justices and their background or the court procedure. Why are there 11 judges? Why does that matter? These are all things that reporters may not be familiar with. They won't know who Lord Panic is, whereas you might have a litigator who's worked with him, perhaps, and you can comment on his advocacy style. You can use Twitter to do that, or you can do it in a little blog yourself. Having these little tiny interesting things to say is a sure way to help you get noticed. So, and we've already, as I've said, we've already spoken about context, but this is very important for legal cases, especially when the judgments come out. Journalists don't have time to read the entire judgment. In fact, my thought was we go right down to the last 2 paragraphs of any judgment, and that will give you what you need to know and fill in the blanks with legal calls to lawyers who would tell you what's happening. The idea is that you speak to them, you tell them what the consequences of this case is, the journalist quotes you, everyone's happy, and everything's great. Problem it comes when you've got about 50, as Tim said, 50 firms all trying to comment on the same case. So you need to have something interesting to say, which may not be related specifically to the matter in hand, but more about the procedure behind it. And I think after this week in particular, there will be a heightened focus on the Supreme Court and its mechanisms. So there will be plenty of people writing about it. We've already seen thousands of column inches on Lady Hale, and no doubt this weekend there'll be lots about the Supreme Court that you can talk about, and this will go on for a long time. So it's worthwhile looking at that. And also, I was just going to say more broadly, just touching on what you said there about the sectors, Tim. Not all legal cases will be relevant to the legal press or the mainstream press. But if, for instance, you're looking at a media law case or a divorce law case, perhaps it's worthwhile thinking about the sectors that you're working in and the magazines in those sectors. So you're tying it in there and alerting the journalist to the case, perhaps before it's even been heard. Because if you wait till Judgment Day, it's unlikely that your quotes will get used. You want to be talking about the case much further down the line. And I suppose when we're talking about the Supreme Court, the beauty of that is that there's already been rulings in the Court of Appeal and the High Court. So you can start blogging about the past proceedings and talking about that in a historic way rather than talking about live proceedings now. So something you may want to do, just as a tip-off, is keep an eye on the court schedule. It's all there on the Supreme Court website. Also, the permission to appeal list. Keep an eye out for cases that are going up to the Supreme Court. And then you tip the journalist off when this happens. And all this helps to build your relationship and hopefully makes you the go-to source when the judgment does finally come down the line. I mean, you can't expect, we've said this over and over, but you can't expect reporters just to naturally come to you. You need to be persistent in contacting them. And if you don't get instantly picked up, maybe you have got something interesting to say. So maybe you use those quotes somewhere else in your blogging or your tweeting or a firm blog. All these things will help to draw attention to you, to your firm, and help you build your expertise for the next time around. So court cases are lengthy beasts. I think I've covered ones that have lasted 3, 4, 5 years. So it's a long-term game, and you need to think about the ways that you can position yourself around that court case to make you the expert at the end of the day.
And I think it's very important. A lot of lawyers do think, particularly those who've gone on some sort of dated how to do marketing course that says and send out a press release somewhere as a one-liner in it, that they think the journalists are there waiting for their press release right at the end of the judgment, whereas court cases, indeed other things as well, as we'll come on to, should be seen not as one-off opportunities. They should be seen as campaigns, as Katie indicated, which offer various bits along the way. These might be comment opportunities, or these might be relationship building opportunities. Indeed, you may even need to tip off the journalists because they've got other things to worry about besides what's going through the court. And if you're the firm that just pops up out of nowhere with a press release right at the end, clearly you're going to struggle against all those firms that have been dealing with the journalists, building relationships, helping them along the way. Okay, on that point, we've talked about piggybacking legal cases, but lawyers don't need to just look at legal cases. There are enormous opportunities elsewhere for them as well. This could be legal angles to all sorts of business stories, clearly regulation, political announcements around intended policies give opportunities. Earlier in the week, the Labour Party conference apparently wanted to seize all private schools. If that you have a practice that targets those, that sort of thing is suddenly presents itself as a very good opportunity. Maybe you do or don't want to get involved in the argy-bargy in the Nationals and Today programme about it, but there's plenty of follow-on opportunities with publications more aimed at that sector. There's tribunals, there's competition, there's M&A. Dare I say it, there's Brussels. Don't think us leaving the EU is going to suddenly stop the Brussels legislation, I foresee probably an even better opportunity once Britain is out of the EU for all sorts of stories from Brussels. They're still going to be producing directives, and there's going to be a constant should Britain comply? What happens if Britain doesn't comply? What do you need to do if Britain doesn't comply? What do you need to do if Britain does comply? Opportunity across all manner of business publications, and well as the nationals as well. But it doesn't even have to be legal stories. If you have a sector practice that, for instance, deals with a lot of M&A, then your partners really should be knowledgeable enough to talk about broader trends in that market, not just legal trends, but broader trends. And indeed, this is what some of the law firms do. If you have an insurance practice, there will be broader trends in the insurance market you can talk about. The same for retail, etc., etc. Now, if you are following the nationals, they move on from issues pretty quick. If you, quite frankly, if you haven't got if something has appeared in the National that morning in the newspaper, unless it's an issue that's going to roll for several days, you probably missed your opportunity with them already. But that's exactly where business publications come in. They have longer deadlines. They are interested in looking on follow-on analysis, comment opportunities, article opportunities, viewpoint opportunities. So don't just think, oh, we've missed the opportunity because the nationals have moved on. Actually, it in fact opens up a lot of doors to your target trade publications. The final way of our 5 that works really well with the national media, business publications, etc., is what's called thought leadership. Now, what is thought leadership? Well, time is against us, and in fact next week we have a dedicated webinar to thought leadership, so I won't go through this in detail, other than a couple of areas I want to highlight. First of all, a number of law firms use freedom of information requests to get interesting bits of data out of government and public bodies, which then use as the basis for getting high-profile press coverage. This is an area that works particularly well for law firms, and FOI requests work well as well because it, by the nature of them, it looks like you've had to drag the information out of the government, so it always has that extra frisson that it looks like you've uncovered hidden insights that someone wanted to keep hidden. So freedom of information requests work very well in those sorts of areas where you can request data from public bodies. What I would also highlight is opinion surveys work really well for getting coverage, but a recent trend, going back to how most media destroyed their business model by giving it all away free online, is that a lot of publications have morphed into, effectively, they see their readership data as their core asset, and actually the publication is a veneer on top of it. And what you'll find, particularly with industry leading publications, so The Lawyer in the legal sector, Retail Week in the retail sector, etc., is they won't carry research that they have not undertaken themselves, or they're going to set a pretty high bar to it if they do, because they want people to buy their data or pay them to help them produce the surveys and other data. So you need to be aware of this trend, and indeed we've spoken to people who've, without our assistance, done these sorts of surveys and then wondered why the legal press hasn't covered it. It's because they are now data organisations as well as publishers. So more about that in our forthcoming webinar. We'll email you details of it if you've not signed up already. So what should you do next after this? Well, all the information and all the research shows that when you do training such as this, if you give yourself now a list of action points, you will get lots of value from it. If you don't, you'll have forgotten it by 5 p.m. So I'm going to give you a little list of the sorts of things you might do. Hopefully you have also given yourself some action points. If so, diarise them for Monday morning to get them going if you're not going to do them this afternoon. First of all, start thinking about your communication strategy. Who is it you're after? What are the key messages? And by key messages, I don't mean sort of bland marketing messages like our partners give more time than blah, blah. I'm talking about what is it that really makes you stand out as experts and go-to people compared to other law firms? What is distinctive about you? And also think about the key challenges of the people you want to reach, because if you are talking about their key challenges, then they're going to pay attention to you. Start to build up blogs, articles, case studies. Get a quick timetable and plan of what you're going to do this autumn to make it happen, what you're going to do next week to make it happen. Perhaps also think about getting an intern to review what your competitors are doing and do yourself a report on this to see what they're doing, what you can learn from it, where you can get ahead of them. Think about what is your next initiative that's coming up. Start putting together a timetable and plan, not a timetable that says, and finally, at the end, we will issue a press release to journalists that have never heard of us. Think about the sorts of lessons Katie was talking about earlier that gives you a plan that builds up the relationships, gives them the heads up, so that when you deliver your bombshell, they are going to report it rather than find that your bombshell arrives at 50 others do. And of course, diarise our webinar on Friday. I'm going to do my utmost to make sure that we don't have any crashing computers at the last minute next time. So, can I invite you to send through further questions, which we will answer very shortly. Ahead of this, can I indeed flag up, we have a whole range of webinars coming up that are particularly relevant to law firms, getting your thought leadership right. I have a Google Ads expert presenting on the 11th of October, Dominic Renshaw. Google Ads is something I note some law firms do, some have dabbled in, and some of it, quite frankly, have got their fingers burnt by them, and others have been too scared to get them off the ground. He will be helping you, whichever group of those you fall into, get the most out of Google AdWords. We'll be talking later on. We've got one aimed at legal techs, and then in November we've got successful blogging for law firms, which, as we've mentioned on a number of times, are particularly relevant for building up your reputation, whether it's with journalists, but quite frankly, more importantly, as blogs should be one of the cornerstones of the marketing for most law firms. So we'll be talking about why that is and how to do it on that webinar. Okay, questions. Okay, Katie, I have one question. When your spokesperson has a phone conversation with a journalist, should the PR person be on the call? Perhaps you could answer that from your perspective as a journalist. You probably had this request lots of times. How did you find it?
Yeah, we did have it. We did have it quite a lot. Actually, it was something that the editor, Kat Griffiths, was really against doing, especially if you're out at meetings. You didn't really want the PR sitting in on the meetings, and you really didn't want them sitting in on a call. First of all, there are a number of reasons. First of all, you don't want the PR stopping the interviewee saying what they want to say. But secondly, because the expert isn't the PR, it is the lawyer. So they should be knowledgeable enough to be able and trustworthy enough to speak on their own behalf or the firm's behalf without a PR interfering. The only time when it is okay is, I think, personally, when it's something that's a little bit more contentious, perhaps, something a bit more controversial, and that depends on the PR, of course. But if the lawyer involved may want an extra layer of protection, so having a PR listening quietly in the background might not be such a bad thing. But there may be times when actually the journalist wants that as well, because it protects them and they have somebody to come back to. But as a general rule, it's something that I wouldn't encourage. Instead, you need your PR there at the beginning to have you all prepped and trained, ready to take that call.
Yes, I think a lot of, particularly corporate American firms and the big firms, have a
They
requirement. There's always a PR person on the call. I mean, clearly, if that's the corporate rule, that's the corporate rule. Although what we now find is that they want to, firms want to expand it. You have the PR person, the marketing manager, the global head of comms, and suddenly there's four people on the line. And
what you see is, and the resulting copy in the article at the end of it. I mean, the reason the lawyer never used stock quotes is because you can tell they're written down exactly the same as you can tell written answers are written down when they come via email. And if you take a closer look at the questions, Q&As from the American lawyers who've been questioned for PRs on the phone, and the UK lawyers who tend not to, what you find is that the UK lawyers are much more free to talk about things in a language that communicates with the audience, whereas the Americans tend to be a bit more corporate and restricted in what they say.
Yes, I think their style reflects that the American relationship between firms and journalists is a lot more, quite frankly, adversarial and impersonal than here. So I think your point on that is that firms need to be careful when simply applying these sorts of big company corporate guidelines, although clearly you've always got to follow what your firm's rules are if you are one of those companies. But I think you've got to bear in mind at the end of the day, if it's a journalist, it's a choice between a painful teleconference with 4 people on the line and a quick phone to the mobile phone of their favourite expert. You're going to come off. You're not going to build up those sorts of relationships. Although clearly, if it's a sensitive issue around something your firm feels it could get negative coverage out, that's different to proactive comment on legal cases. Okay, Katie, firms, clearly partners get put up for interviews. From the perspective of the legal press, must it always be partners? Who would you want to be interviewing, whether it's a legal case, but perhaps also issues about the firm?
I think, as a hard, fast rule at the lawyer, we almost generally always spoke to partners. But when it came to the operational running day-to-day of running the law firm, of course, you want to speak to the expert in that firm. So it might be the managing partner, or it could be the head of IT, or if it's about people, it could be the head of HR. It doesn't have to be a partner as such. It just has to be somebody who is familiar with that issue. On cases, on background, I used to speak to senior associates quite a lot because partners are so busy, and but they would be authorised by the partner to speak to me, but they would never be quoted. The partner would always be quoted at front, but senior associates off record. I think it's different in the sector press and in the national media, because a lawyer is a lawyer and they are an expert in their field. It doesn't matter about titles. They don't really understand the difference between an associate, senior associate, partner, equity partner, a full equity partner. They don't. So the hierarchical legal press, partners preferably, if not heads of department, heads of their operations, etc. Whereas in the national press, it's the lawyer who's best placed to talk.
Right, time is our enemy as ever, and we've reached our the end of our allotted time. So can I first of all say a big thank you to everyone for joining us, whether you are joining us live or you've joined us listening to the recording. Again, if you have questions that come up, do email us. You can get hold of our details through our website, details below, or indeed just by replying to the various emails you've had promoting this webinar and providing you in the very near future with a recording of it. Thank you very much for all our expert input there, Katie.
No problem. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I hope we get to work with you soon.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye-bye.